Hello, today is October 11th, and I'm going to talk about Europe. Um, Europe sometimes is on the back burner because it doesn't seem very interesting, but there's lots of interesting stuff going on in Europe right now. But before I talk about Europe per se, let me talk about, for a minute, the US and Europe. You will recall that under the Trump administration, we weren't much interested in anything having to do with anybody in the world in particular. We were hostile to NATO, we were hostile to the European Union, we were hostile to interacting with several European countries. The only thing the Trump administration was keen on doing was linking with Hungary and Poland, especially Mr. Orban in Hungary, who is a, shall we say, authoritarian leader, to put it mildly. Trump administration seems to have had fuzzy and warm relations with him. And Europe eventually came around to sort of making noises that they would have to go it alone. They can't count on the US, etc. Macron of France in particular was making noises that we have to rely on ourselves. We can't rely on the United States. And so Europe collectively had a sigh of relief when the Biden administration came into power. After all, Biden, an experienced foreign policy person in the United States, perfectly warm and good relations with Europe, and his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, a very experienced person, and one who, and this will come up again in the talk today, partially grew up in France. His mother remarried and they lived in France. He went to school in France, and it is said that he speaks French without an accent. Other people in the administration, Sullivan, National Security Council, also some experience. It is also true that the Biden administration inherited a State Department which had very many empty spaces in it, because during the Trump administration, Trump supporters were appointed, and many very good and experienced foreign policy people, foreign service officers, were fired. So the Biden administration started out, and to some extent still has, very many empty holes in important positions throughout the State Department. I think there are 80 vacancies in the State Department, and the Senate has refused to fill them. And so they, on the one hand, they had good leadership. On the other hand, of course, they had limited backup in the State Department. Nevertheless, I, amongst, I suppose, everybody commenting on it, was rather shocked when the United States decided to make its what is known as AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom and US agreement with Australia to provide it with nuclear submarines in the area. There are sort of two problems with that, just that announcement and that reality. One has to do with escalating things with China, which is in the region, which we'll talk about some other time. But the other, of course, was that France, as you mostly know, had agreements with Australia to buy French submarines, non-nuclear submarines. And the US agreement with Australia nixed the agreement with France without any consultation with the French government. And Macron went ballistic. And I must say that in the history of post-World War II relationships with Western Europe, I can't recall a single instance where the US would not have consulted even during, let's say, Bush administration, Nixon administration, and so forth, with its European ally, who, in this case, it was France, would be impacted. So the Biden administration got off to a rather bad start with Europe because of the non-consultation with France. And that led Macron, but also others, the European Union and others, to say the United States does not prioritize its longstanding post-World War II relationship with us. They seem to act without consultation. We can't count on them, and we better figure out ways to get along with ourselves individually and collectively. Because we can no longer count on the United States. This is a cataclysmic change of direction in events because really Europe, West Europe in any event, have been the closest allies of the United States with, very steady consultation. And it's not just France. Before the brouhaha over the nuclear submarines, the Prime Minister of England, Johnson, who, to put it mildly, is an odd and difficult character, called Biden. And it is said that it took the Biden administration and Biden 2 days to get back to him. Now, that does seem like a lot, but considering that the tightest security arrangements that the United States has is with the United Kingdom, and it is unheard of that if the prime minister, whoever he or she may be, calls the president of the United States, there is very fast, the same day, if not within hours, response. That is to say, they can get each other on the line. The fact that this did not happen, whether it was sloppiness, whether it was targeted, whose idea it was, whether Biden knew about it or not, is not clear. But there have been now 2 instances where the Europeans can say to themselves, gee, the U.S. is no longer necessarily a reliable ally. Now, the U.S. defends itself by saying it's continuing Obama's policy of moving its attention to the Pacific and to China. But from the perspective of Europeans, this is not an either or issue. So I would say that the Biden administration got off to a very bad start with respect to Europe. And of course, Europe needs the US needs Europe, and these things will get papered over. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, went to talk to Macron and apologized and tried to remedy the situation. But it is a sign and a symbol of a change in U.S. policy, perhaps, or minimally a lack of sensitivity as to what we owe our allies and they owe us in terms of ongoing and continuing close relationship. At the end of the day, of course, the U.S. may have a difference of opinion with one or more European countries, but it's the lack of prior consultation, the lack of warning what we're about to do, the lack of access, the lack of giving those leaders the dignity that they matter to us, that I think was a very important breach. And I very much hope, for the sake of U.S. policy, that this can be remedied. Now, then let me turn to Europe itself. What's going on in Europe is both interesting and to some extent alarming. You will know that Angela Merkel is about to retire. The Germans had an election. The Social Democrats came out slightly ahead, which means that Angela Merkel's party looks like it will not be in government. But what's interesting about it is that in order to put a government together based on the election, Germany will have to piece together 3 different political groupings, going both to the left of it with the Greens and to the right of it as well with a smaller party. So a coalition will have to emerge, and how long the coalition will take to put together, who knows? In the meantime, Angela Merkel is still head of the German government. But what's happening in Germany, which already has happened in France, which is that the center right and the center left parties, which used to run Western European countries, are to some extent no longer holding the electorate. So, and multiple smaller parties have emerged so that European elections now will have to merge different parties. Sometimes the dominant party that got most of the votes has to make league and alliances with a party that's considerably to the right or the left of it. And as you know, populists on the right and the left are everywhere in Europe, Western Europe, as well as Eastern Europe right now. And that's really is a serious issue, because if you think about it, it's the United States and Europe which are the role models for democracy, right? And in many countries, including the US, you have a two-party system. In the US, you continue to have a two-party system, but we can already tell by looking at the Democratic Party in the US that the so-called moderates and the so-called progressives can't see eye to eye. If we had a multi-party system, those groupings might in fact be different parties. So while the rigidity of the two-party system in the United States is still present in a way that it is not in several European countries, the fact of the matter is that the electorate in the democratic countries of the West are splitting into subgroups, and subgroups which no necessarily don't have very much in common, other that they're still going through democratic processes and elections. And unlike the US, where the Republican Party could easily be headed into a single authoritarian party, right? That is what 78% of Republicans are perfectly happy to have, Trump have won or to overthrow the election for Biden. And we do not represent a very good role model or picture for democratic societies right now, because everybody is afraid that Trump may come into power. And that pretty much ends our historical democratic two-party party system as we have known it up until now. So the Europeans are very nervous about the United States because they can't tell what's going to happen in the midterm elections and the next elections. And meantime, the Europeans themselves are struggling, West Europeans are struggling with a range of parties in their own societies. And for anybody to govern, it means alliances very often with ideological bedfellows, which are somewhat removed from where you are standing. Now, it's true that in the German elections and the far right, the authoritarian right, did not get a whole lot of votes, but they're there. And the same thing was of course true in France and is true in France, where Marie Le Pen could theoretically win the next election, especially if Macron can't recoup from various problems he's had, including being insulted by the US and not taken seriously. So politically speaking, we were sort of sleepy about the fact that Western European countries and the United States made this coalition of democratic societies. Some countries, for example, the Netherlands for a long time has had multiple parties and consolidations. In fact, after the German election, it was said they are now pretty much following the Netherlands model, right, of multiple parties, 2 or 3 parties winning, having to consolidate and figuring out a way to proceed. That development is a fairly new development and potentially a scary development for the stability of individual European countries. For example, was, after all, the populist, conservative right, or whatever you want to call them, in the United Kingdom, in England, which led to Brexit, right? And the current prime minister is still enthusiastically in front of Brexit. It turns out that England, UK, having left the European Union, is now creating huge problems. You might have read about in the press in the UK itself. They got rid of most of the people who worked in the UK, who came from other EU countries, who could easily come and work wherever they wanted to. And many of the, for example, truck drivers, many of the harvest people harvesting the crop in England, either came permanently or temporarily to the UK and filled those positions. Now they've all gone home. Now you don't have enough truck drivers. So there's a shortage of goods. There's a shortage of gasoline. Farmers are tearing their hair out because they don't have enough people to manage their crops and harvest their crops. So you can see that it's one thing to ideologically say, well, we don't need this, or we can do this on our own, or we're going to listen to the right wing. We can be more nationalists, consolidating with the United States and other countries in Europe, and especially about the EU, which I talk about in a minute, is not really necessary. We are going to be more isolationist and more nationalist. And what that leads to right now are problems, as I just mentioned, in Great Britain. But it also sends a real long, or at least medium-term problems to almost all European countries, because given the aging of the European population, given the fact that young people don't want to do low-wage labor of most kinds, almost all European countries, I might add very quickly, the United States included, have been reliant on immigrant labor. And the argument against immigration is not only one in the US, which Republicans and some Democrats are happy to do immigrant bashing, as if we don't need those people in the labor force, but they are leading to serious economic consequences, or beginning to, in some European countries, and I would suggest eventually in the US. Eventually might be the wrong word here, because it is already true that in nursing homes, in fields in California and so forth, the labor that is necessary, that comes largely from immigrant groups, is not available, and there are shortages. So while on the one hand we have unemployment, on the other hand, we also have labor shortages in quite a few areas of the American economy. That is a problem in the US at this point, but it is beginning to be a huge problem in Europe. And what West Europe absorbed was a large proportion of its immigrant labor coming first from East Europe at the end of the Cold War. Some of those countries are now doing better, and people voluntarily went home. Others went home because of the end of the EU. But you also are having in Europe, and that's been covered in the press recently, you have new waves of asylum seekers coming from the Middle East, coming from Afghanistan, and they are being blocked at the borders of East European countries. Hungary has a fairly long record of blocking asylum seekers, but now you have Bulgaria and other countries blocking, people coming into the EU area of one kind or another. You also have Belarus folks fleeing, and or asylum seekers from Afghanistan going through Belarus, trying to get into East and then eventually West Europe. So that is a new issue for Europe. We have this issue on our border, and we have this issue of, the treatment of Haitians as well as people from South America and Central America. But in small European countries, this is beginning to be a huge and political mess. And dare I say, both in the US and in Western European democratic countries, there's a lot of racism involved, right? And anti-Muslim feelings involved. We are fairly homogeneous countries. We've become less homogeneous in the last decades. Now, if even more people come, this will make things worse. You will recall that Angela Merkel allowed, 1 million refugees in. And she has paid a political price, and her party has paid a political price because many Germans, especially East Germans, by the way, which vote heavily right wing, are seriously opposed to this. There are similar problems in France, in Holland, increasingly even in Scandinavia, or Scandinavian countries, which often were more generous. So part of the instability in Europe as we speak is wrought through increasing complexity of the political spectrum from right to left, and the difficulty of managing from the center. And part of it is also the cultural difficulties that arise from asylum seekers and refugees from all over the world. And democratic societies are not particularly good at managing them, even though, of course, they're better at managing them than authoritarian governments, which just simply close the borders and refuse to let people in. Let me quickly turn to the European Union. The European Union has been, let's put it that way, on very shaky grounds with Brexit. It has new leadership, Ursula von der Leyen, for the last couple of years. It wasn't clear that she was going to be or is a very strong leader. In some ways, they came late to the party of addressing climate, trade, any number of things. And yet at the same time, as things are getting shaky in terms of cooperation and alliances with the United States, there is a kind of a new idea of let's try to pull together and make the European Union work better. You may know that Macron in France was actually arguing that quite aside from NATO, which became at risk under the Trump administration, the European Union itself should have military capacity and coordination. And so the situation during the Trump administration, and now even in the post-Trump era, of the US not necessarily being able to count on, has led the European Union to get a little bit of a second wind in terms of saying, we better stick together. We're small countries, and yes, our citizens are increasingly nationalistic and don't want cooperation and don't want to give up resources for the collective good and so forth. But at the same time, insofar as there is a center and there is at least a moderate left and right, we better figure out some way to make the European Union as well as other collective mechanisms in Europe work again. So I would say that in the last few months, especially because people was kind of waiting to see what the outcome of the American election and the consequence of the Biden administration bungling things with respect to Europe, has given a kind of a new life to the idea, not necessarily policies yet, but to the idea that the EU better organize itself and build itself up and take control. Now, the thing I haven't mentioned at all is East Europe, which increasingly, of course, is authoritarian. There is Hungary, there is Poland, and so on. And here it's interesting things are happening. I mean, on the one hand, of course, they're also anti-immigration. They're very, anti even doing anything for asylum seekers. But they are also increasingly authoritarian nationalists. And with that in mind, the court, the European Court of Justice, has ruled, especially in the case of Poland, but also increasingly looked at Hungary, that the government is violating the norms in human rights and freedom of the press and other things that are part and parcel of being a member of the European Union. Now, the Poles have responded, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, by thumbing their noses and saying, no, the European Union has no right to interfere in our domestic legal systems. We have not violated anything, and so on. Without boring you with the details of that, it's kind of interesting to see here that you have the European Court, right, Human Rights and Court of Justice, asserting themselves on behalf of the values of Western Europe, and saying to Eastern Europe, you're increasingly violating some of our norms, and you better stop it. Now, some are arguing in Western Europe that if Hungary and Poland, keeps reducing freedom of the press, imprisoning journalists and other opposition leaders, that they should just be terminated and kicked out of the European Union. So that sets up an interesting dynamic, which might play itself out in the next year or two, is how far will the European Union allow member states to violate the norms, the democratic and legal norms of the European Union, because it wants to keep the East Europeans who are members of the EU in the EU and hopes to influence them. And at which point will they have said, we have had it. We rather have a smaller European Union and not be bothered by these authoritarian members in our midst. It's a very dynamic and I would say to you a very interesting question, which is worth watching. There have been discussions for some years in Europe to allow other Balkan countries, former Yugoslavian countries, Albania, and so forth, to join the European Union. And there has been much discussion in the last year as to what it would take to enlarge the European Union by bringing the Balkans in. I agree with those who think that that's not in the near future. There's ongoing discussion, but I don't think it's in the near future because each of the countries would have to change a sufficient amount in terms of its governance structure, legal structure, and so forth to be allowed to enter. And they're not prepared or capable of doing that as yet. And at the same time, it would require a lot of the resources of the existing members of the European Union to transfer to those countries to help them to reach the economic and social, political, and judicial level that's expected. Some of you may recall that years ago, when Spain entered the European Union after its dictatorship came to an end, there was a big hullabaloo in Germany and other West European countries that it was too costly, that the taxpayers of Europe had to pay for Spain to bring Spain aboard. Well, there has been very little said about that recently because, of course, Spain is relatively affluent now and is not requiring the transfers of those kinds of resources. But there are a lot of Balkan countries and they're very needy. So I wouldn't expect anything to be happening there very soon. That raises the question of Turkey, which I want to bring up before I go away. Turkey is a member of NATO. Erdogan, the head of state of Turkey, is an authoritarian leader. He too is imprisoning everybody who is in opposition. And there's been much discussion over the years of Turkey entering or joining the European Union. Historically, the fact that Turkey was not brought into European Union has a lot to do with racism in Europe. That is to say, the Europeans, members of the EU, did not want to have the European Union diluted by a bunch of Turks, Muslims, etc. So the arguments over the years, when will Turkey be ready and so forth, has been going on for years. But now there's a new dynamic, and the new dynamic is not simply will the Turkey join the EU. That's very unlikely given the current circumstances for anybody to even want to consider that. But rather, what about the relationship of Turkey with NATO? And NATO, of course, is very important, was very important during the Cold War, but still is considered an important organization in Europe. And if you recall, the Europeans were very alarmed when Trump said, well, we should get out of NATO. We're paying too much, they're not paying enough, and all the rest. Now, Biden administration is committed to NATO, so that's a good thing. But whether or not NATO should allow a country like Turkey to continue to be part of it is an open and it's an interesting question. And Erdogan is just smart enough to kind of put weights on both sides of the scale, because he has made recent arrangements to buy arms from Russia and to sort of say to the European Union, to NATO, don't bug us. If you, criticize us too much, we'll just get out of NATO and make more of an alliance with Russia. That leads me, I know I'm kind of all over the place, but there's so many simultaneous things going on with respect to Europe, to the fact that Russia is the largest supplier of gas for Germany, and the pipeline of bringing gas to Germany has more or less been completed. And so not only Germany, the biggest economy in Western Europe, but also other countries are somewhat interdependent with Russia. And in terms of their economic manufacturing, for example, in Germany, very interdependent with China. So while the US can take strong measures, or at least it thinks it can, with respect to China, it makes some of the Europeans who have a large amount of trade with China very nervous. And the US sort of looking at the dependence of, for example, Germany on Russian gas makes the US also nervous in terms of its links and, generally speaking, reasonable relations with Russia. The energy issue in Europe is increasingly getting serious this winter. There is not enough oil and gas generated electricity. We may have problems as well. That's a separate topic which we need to discuss some other time. There is both delivery, price issues. It may very well be, or it is assumed to be, a pretty cold winter, and a dangerously cold winter. Some of you might have read Friedman's op-ed piece in the New York Times about the subject a few days ago. But there are serious linkages between countries which otherwise don't align politically, but which have become enmeshed economically. Europe and Russia, Europe and China, for example, it differs from country to country, but it is not the case that all the trade, all the access to natural resources is between Europe and the United States and is under the control of the United States. So where do we wind up here? We wind up with the fact that events in Europe have heated up and have become very interesting, very complex, and newly complex over the last, starting during Trump administration, but right now. How countries will act politically is unclear. There's an election coming up in France in a year. Various other West European countries have had complicated elections, right, left. Um, all countries now have right-wing authoritarian populists, racists. Uh, what I said about 20 minutes ago, in almost all European countries, the two center parties, center left and center right, seem no longer in control. They're having to compromise and consult and bring into government smaller parties. That is raising all kinds of difficulties politically and economically. And meantime, we in the United States are fixated on our own problems, on China, to some extent Iran. We haven't even discussed that, but that hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention from the US under the Biden administration so far, even though the Europeans have been actively working. I would say that in general, the state of affairs in international politics is at the moment probably more fluid and potentially dangerous, militarily, politically, and economically, than it has been for a long time. No, we're not talking about a Cold War between two countries necessarily. We're talking about the fact that the anchors which lends stability, the democratic fellow societies which we are dependent on, the changes in the populations in the world, the aging of the populations, the globalization of the economy, which when there are difficulties like COVID, and as you no doubt even read in the Sentinel, tankers piling up in all the harbors, goods not coming to market. There are all kinds of stoppages of the flow of the global economy that we were used to having fairly easy flow, and they're increasingly defensive citizens in the United States and in European countries who don't mind going with some authoritarian who is a nationalist and who says, I can fix this, and we can just, pull down the blinds and manage ourselves. That is a fool's errand. But while these fool's errand parties are mobilizing everywhere, you see the kind of mess that the Brexit has created in the UK, and you can see similar economically and politically, socially. You can see messes coming in otherwise stable European countries. And of course, everybody in Europe is looking at the United States very fearful that the Republican Party is no longer a reasonable democratic party, and that what happens if they get reelected somehow. So on that sort of troubling note, it's worth not pulling up down the blinds and imagining that we don't need to worry about these things. We really do need to worry about them, because sooner or later they will impact us all, and we're not safe from the waves and the storms that are happening outside the United States. Thank you very much, and see you in a couple of weeks.